Good morning, grandkids. Today is going to be the last chapter of this story. And this is the Phantom of the Woods. And this is also chapter 11. And this will be the ending chapter. Remember, at the end of the last chapter, they had just come up on this place where Audrey, the ghosty thing, has been leading them to, and she's pointing straight down at the ground where she's standing. So this is where this chapter opens. "Hey," I murmured, "maybe it's a grave." "Well, since she's dead, maybe it's her grave," Mr. Owen said. "Could be," Dad said. "Then again, maybe she fought with whoever killed her. Maybe she's grasping something that would identify them." "Or," I said, "she may have wanted someone to come up here just to find her body, since no one knew where she was." A lot of questions. "Well, let's go over there and see what's what," Dan said. We all moved toward where she was at, still pointing down. As we moved closer, she started slowly disappearing down into the ground and disappeared where she had been pointing. We looked at each other, then around on the ground. "Well," Dell said, "I knew we'd need a shovel." And he started digging where we saw the girl disappear into the ground. The rest of us wandered around to see if we could find anything laying around that might be related to whatever happened up here. Dad said, "Look, here's a Camel's cigarette butt. I think Mr. Connor's the only man in town who smokes these." I watched and saw him put it into his pocket. Finally, Mr. Owen asked for help so he could rest a minute. I went over and took the shovel and started digging. The men stood around talking, speculating about what had happened. Finally, I felt the shovel hit something solid. Could be a rock, but I doubted it. The men gathered around as I stuck the shovel into the ground once more and throwing the dirt up over the edge of the shallow hole. There were 2 joined bones. I heard the men talking as I moved up a little, over a foot, and stuck the shovel into the ground again. There was, from what I could see, were the partially exposed hip bones. "Yeah, that's gotta be her," Dan said. We could see, as I continued digging carefully, that there was still bits of decaying and dried flesh still clinging here and there. Also, some ragged pieces of rotting clothing. It stunk, and when I saw some beetles and worms crawling around, I threw the shovel down and turned away. One of the men walked over and removed more dirt to get to the skull. I was glad, because I knew I didn't want to see that. I went behind a tree and threw up. By that time, all 3 men were standing there talking when we all heard something, or someone, moving in the trees nearby. The men picked up their rifles. About that time, Mr. Connor walked out of the edge of the woods. "Well," Mr. Street said, "did you decide to come and help after all? Afraid you're too late." Connor stood there looking at us, then looked over at the grave. then back at us. He seemed at a loss for words, but I could imagine what all was going on inside his head. He stood there in a camouflage hunter's coat and boots, his rifle hanging from the crook of his arm, like a hunter being startled, coming upon some other hunters. But I knew he wasn't. I saw fear in his eyes. Dad was the first one to speak. "Hello, Mr. Connor. Did you change your mind since I came to see you? Did you come to help us?" Connor just stood there, looking from one of us to the other. Dad went on. "Afraid you're late. We already found what we came for." As Dad was talking, I saw Mr. Connor raise his rifle up slightly. The men saw it too, and I heard 3 rifles being raised. Mr. Dell said, "We found a grave up here. No marker or anything. We started digging into it and found bones. Some flesh still attached. Even some fabric that could maybe be identified." "Yeah," Dan Streets said. "Want to come over here and see?" Dad motioned for me to back away, then said, "Eric, it's your daughter, Audrey." He stuck his hand in his pocket and pulled out the Camel's cigarette. "We also found one of your cigarette butts close to the grave." As he was speaking, we saw Connor raise his rifle up some more. Our men's rifles were perfectly centered on Connor's chest. "Would you mind telling us why the cigarette was here by the grave? This looks pretty bad for you," Dad went on. Connor's eyes squinted as he said, "I could have dropped my cigarette here any time. I explored around this old burned ruins often enough." "Yeah?" Dan Street said. "Why didn't we find it by the burned down shack then, instead of over there by your daughter's grave?" Dad said, "Did you bring Audrey up here to explore with you and the 2 of you get in a fight? Or did you bring her body up here after you had killed her?" And at that moment, Mr. Connor did 2 things at once. He yelled, "You'll never tell anyone," and fired his rifle at Dad. Dad knew what was coming and had stepped to the side just in time, and all 3 men fired their rifles. Connor dropped with a startled look in his eyes as he slowly bled out. Dad gave it a minute, then walked over to him, stooped down and placed his fingers on the side of Connor's neck. No pulse. He turned and looked at us, then shook his head. Connor was gone. We stood there a minute. Then Mr. Owen said, "I think we need to discuss this before we decide what to do." "Agreed," Dad said. "Yeah, we need to get our stories straight," Dan said. I said, "I know I might be too young to have an opinion, but since I was here, I guess I'd better have one. I think we should bury him. I think Audrey was concerned enough to let someone know where she was at. I don't know why she chose me to appear to. She also wanted her killer taken care of. I think that we've done everything she wanted." Dan said, I think Tucker's right. We could bury him and forget it. We don't need police and a trial and so on going up here over this. They might find us guilty of something. Connor fired first. Dell said, I think both of you are pretty much right. We'd have a hard time proving that he fired at us first. Dan said, what about his wife, Triss? She's going to be asking questions. I said, I don't think that will be any problem. She'll just be wondering, where's he gone? Or, he just up and left me. You know how he treated her. She'll probably be glad and stop wondering soon enough. All right then, Dad said. We'll make a pact. None of us will ever mention anything about this to anyone, not even our wives. And Dad turned and looked at me. I nodded my head, and he went on. Let's dig a grave and bury him in the trees, out of sight. Throw a few sticks and leaves over it. Soon it'll never be noticed. Do the same with Audrey's grave. Everyone got busy on the graves after agreeing never to mention this. I was glad this was over. Also glad that now I could get down to more serious and interesting business with Susan, and I finally was able to come up with a little grin. So that's the end of the story. Everything is silence about it from then on. And now I'm going to be anxious to get back to Dorothy, the young wizard. I want to do another episode of that story. And I'm going to get busy at that. I don't know when I'll get to start reading it, but I got to get started on making outlines, making notes, deciding on who's going to do what and where. So I will be with you all later on my story time on Fridays. And thank you for listening to this. And I personally am glad that it's ended because I'm anxious to get to Dorothy. So I will see you all later, grandkids.